The little black girl knocked at the service door, telling the biker someone locked her mom under the platforms. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It all began one evening, under the harsh glare of the carnival lights, when a little black girl ran towards the service door of the biker bar, her small frame trembling with fear. She was no more than 8 years old, her dress torn, and her eyes wide with terror. She didn't know who to turn to, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to get help, and fast. She grabbed the sleeve of the nearest biker and cried out, "Please help! They locked my mom under the platforms." The biker, a gruff man named Jake Hawk Morrison, had seen his fair share of rough situations, but this was different. The terror in the girl's voice made his blood run cold. "What do you mean, kid?" he asked, kneeling down to her level, tried to keep his voice calm. The girl pointed a trembling finger towards the far side of the carnival grounds, where the lights flickered ominously in the distance. "They took her. My mom's locked under the platforms. I tried to get her out, but I couldn't. Please, you have to help me." Jake's heart clenched as he looked at the other bikers around him. They were all part of the Iron Riders Motorcycle Club, a group of men who had once been part of a much darker world. Now, they were trying to make a difference, doing community service and helping people in need. But this was different. This was personal. Jake stood up, his expression hardening. Without a word, he signaled for the others to follow. They didn't hesitate. "Get your bikes now," he ordered, and the club members moved with precision. No one asked questions. They knew when a child was in danger. The time for questioning was over. They were on their bikes. In minutes, roaring to life like a thunderstorm that couldn't be stopped. The little girl, still crying, climbed onto Jake's bike, clutching onto him tightly as they sped towards the platform area she had pointed to. The ride was swift, the roar of the engines filling the night air as they made their way through the carnival grounds. The closer they got, the more Jake could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong. They pulled up to a dark corner of the carnival, the platforms looming in front of them, silent and eerie. The girl pointed to a small, unmarked door at the base of one of the platforms. "That's where they locked her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The bikers dismounted in unison, their boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The sense of urgency was palpable. They knew they didn't have much time. Jake approached the door, his hand hovering over the knob. His instincts were on high alert. Something wasn't right. Just as he was about to turn the handle, a low, menacing voice called out from the shadows. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake spun around, his eyes narrowing. From the darkness emerged a tall man, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. Jake could see the outline of a gun tucked into the waistband of his jeans. He had the look of someone who didn't care about the law. The man's voice was thick with menace. "This is none of your business," he growled. Jake didn't flinch. He had been in tougher situations than this. He glanced at his club members, all of whom were now surrounding the man, their expressions unreadable. "It's our business when a child is involved," Jake said firmly. The man laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You think you could just waltz in here and take what's mine?" he sneered. Jake's jaw tightened. He had no time for this. He stepped forward, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'm not leaving until that little girl's mother is safe," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise. The man took a step back, his hand inching towards the gun. But before he could make a move, one of the bikers, a massive man named Diesel, stepped forward, his presence intimidating. "You don't want to do that, Diesel," said in a low growl. The man hesitated, then seemed to reconsider. With a quick motion, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows. Jake didn't waste any time. He kicked the door open with one swift movement. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of mold and stale air. The girl's mother lay unconscious on the cold floor, barely breathing. Jake knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. She was alive, but barely. The bikers quickly set to work. One of them called an ambulance while the others kept watch. Jake looked at the little girl, who was now clinging to his side, her eyes full of fear and hope. "She's going to be okay," Jake promised, giving her a reassuring smile. The girl nodded, still trembling, but relieved. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe again. The bikers had kept their promise. They had saved her mother, and they would make sure she was never in danger again. The moment the door slammed shut behind them, the heavy silence in the abandoned platform room weighed down on the group. Jake Hawk Morrison stood still, his eyes scanning the unconscious woman on the floor. His hand hovered above her pulse, feeling the faint rhythm of her heartbeat. She was alive, barely but alive. The bikers around him had quickly fallen into their usual roles. Some were checking the perimeter, while others were talking to the young girl, trying to comfort her after the traumatic ordeal. Diesel, the club's massive enforcer, stood guard by the door, his watchful eyes never leaving the shadows, knowing that the danger was far from over. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The girl's mother, now in his care, had been locked under the platforms, likely for much longer than anyone realized. The sound of the approaching sirens grew louder. He could feel the air shift, knowing that the fight was about to escalate. This wasn't just some random act of violence. It was personal, it was dangerous, and it had just crossed a line no one in the Iron Riders could ignore. As the ambulance pulled up, Jake looked over at the girl, still clutching his arm with a grip that showed both fear and a desperate need for reassurance. "She's going to be okay," Jake said softly, though. There was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. The girl nodded, tears still streaking her face, but she was no longer trembling as violently as she had been. She was beginning to trust that someone had her back. Moments later, paramedics rushed in, quickly assessing the woman's condition. They immediately placed an oxygen mask over her face and moved her onto a stretcher. Jake stepped back, his gaze locking with the paramedic in charge. "She's been through a lot," Jake said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of concern. "Keep her stable. She needs to get to the hospital, and fast." The paramedic nodded, and with a swift movement, they wheeled her out to the waiting ambulance. Jake took one last look at the platform room, his mind still reeling from the situation. He knew this wasn't over. The woman's injuries, the locked platforms. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. And the man who had done this, he was still out there. The thought of that man, the girl's stepfather, lurking in the shadows, made Jake's jaw tighten. This wasn't just a random act of abuse. It was an act of control, an act of power. And Jake wasn't going to let him get away with it. He turned to Diesel. "We need to find him, and we need to find him fast." Diesel's eyes hardened. "You got it, boss." Jake glanced at the young girl again. She was standing with one of the other bikers now, her tiny hand gripping the leather jacket of the club member as though it were the only thing anchoring her to this moment. She was safe for now, but Jake knew the real battle was still to come. As the ambulance pulled away, Jake made a quick decision. He pulled out his phone and typed a message into the group chat. "We're not done here. We need information, fast. Everyone dig deep." The responses came in almost immediately. Members of the club were already reaching out to their connections, friends in law enforcement, people in the local community, anyone who might know something about the girl's stepfather. Jake wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. The stakes had just gotten higher. "We're going to make sure he never hurts anyone again," Jake muttered under his breath. His resolve was unwavering. The club had never shied away from a fight, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. And now they had a new mission, one that would lead them down a dangerous path, one that would test their loyalty to the core. As the bikers revved their engines, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the carnival grounds. Jake stood, watching the last of the emergency vehicles drive away, his mind already working through the next steps. They would find this man, and they would stop him. No one would harm a child under their watch, and they would make sure that Maya, the little girl who had led them here, would never be afraid again. The night had fallen quiet, but Jake's mind was anything but still. As the club members split up, diving into their investigation, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The young girl, Maya, was now with one of the members, safe in a quiet corner of the bar. But Jake knew the danger wasn't over. They had taken down the immediate threat, getting Maya's mother to the hospital. But the real fight had just begun. They were up against someone with power and influence, and Jake wasn't sure just how deep this went. He couldn't let his guard down, not yet. The next few hours felt like an eternity as the club worked the phones and sent out people to dig into the man who had hurt Maya's mother. Forge, the leader of the Thunderwolves, had called in a favor from his contacts in law enforcement, pulling strings to get any information about Officer Patrick Donovan. The bikers had their own network too. People they trusted, people who owed them, people who knew how to get the truth when others couldn't. Jake stood by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the parking lot, waiting for updates. Diesel approached him, holding a folder. "Got something," Diesel said, handing it over. Jake opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. It didn't take long for the pieces to start falling into place. Officer Patrick Donovan wasn't just a regular cop. He had connections, ties to powerful people, and an ironclad reputation in the local community. He had coached youth football, volunteered at church, and on the surface was the perfect image of a family man. But Jake knew better. His instincts screamed that Donovan wasn't just a man trying to protect his family. He was hiding something far darker, something that Jake was determined to uncover. "This guy's a ghost," Jake muttered. "He knows how to play the system." Diesel nodded. "Too clean. Too smooth. People like him don't leave a trail unless they want to." The weight of the situation pressed harder on Jake's chest. He wasn't just dealing with an abusive stepfather. This was a man who knew how to manipulate the law, how to cover his tracks. He had probably done it before. He couldn't let Donovan slip through their fingers. As the night wore on, the bikers regrouped at the bar. Their faces were grim, and the usual camaraderie that came with a ride had turned into quiet determination. Everyone knew that tomorrow would be the real test. They had to confront Donovan, and they had to do it carefully. This wasn't just about taking down a bully. It was about protecting a child, about making sure that no one else would ever fall victim to the same fate. "We need to get to him first," Jake said, pacing the room. "The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop him." Forge walked in just as Jake was speaking, his phone in hand. He looked up and met Jake's eyes. "I just spoke to a few people in the department. Donovan's not just any cop. He's on the payroll of some very bad people. People who make a lot of money disappear and sweep things under the rug. He's got a lot more to lose than just his job." The room fell silent, the weight of Forge's words sinking in. This wasn't just about saving Maya's mother anymore. This was about stopping a criminal network, a network that had been operating under the guise of respectability for far too long. "So what's the play?" Diesel asked, breaking the silence. "We confront him," Jake said firmly. "We go in and make him understand that we're not backing down." But Forge held up a hand. "Not like that. Not yet. We're doing this by the book. I've got a lawyer lined up who's going to help us gather enough evidence to take him down legally. If we make one wrong move, it'll all be over before it even starts." Jake's mind raced. He hated waiting, but he knew Forge was right. They couldn't afford to screw this up. The room seemed to hold its breath as the bikers filed out, each man and woman preparing for the next phase of the mission. Jake couldn't help but glance over at Maya, still sitting quietly in the corner. She had no idea what was coming next, but Jake was determined to make sure that, no matter what, she'd never have to fear for her safety again. It was going to be a long day. They'd have to move quickly, and they'd have to be smart. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and Jake knew that the fight ahead would be unlike any they had faced before. The next morning came too quickly, and with it, the weight of what was to come. Jake Hawk Morrison had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Donovan and what lay ahead. It was still dark when he stood in front of the club, the air crisp and cold against his leather jacket. His thoughts kept returning to Maya and her mother, to the promise he had made to Tyrone years ago. He would keep it, no matter the cost. The rest of the Iron Riders were already gathered, their faces set with determination. Diesel, Bear, Vince, and the others stood like sentinels, waiting for Jake to give the word. The plan had been set in motion, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he paced back and forth, the rumble of engines filled the air. The club's bikes were ready, fueled, and roaring to life. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was about justice, about putting an end to the corruption that had taken root in their community. Jake looked at the group of men and women before him. They weren't just bikers. They were a family, and today they were going to protect that family. We ride today, not just for Maya and her mom, but for everyone who's ever been hurt by people like Donovan, Jake said, his voice low and steady. This ends now. He paused, looking each member of the club in the eye. We do it by the book, but we're not backing down. Not for a second. Diesel, the club's enforcer, cracked his knuckles and grinned. Let's get this done. With that, they mounted their bikes, the engines, roaring to life as they sped off, the sound of their collective power filling the morning air. The ride to Donovan's house was quick, but every mile felt like a lifetime. Jake's mind raced with every possible scenario, but the one thing he kept coming back to was that they needed to be ready for anything. They were about to confront a man who had the power to destroy lives, and they had to make sure they didn't give him the chance. As they neared Donovan's home, the mood shifted. It was quiet, too quiet. The house sat on a quiet street, surrounded by neatly manicured lawns and tall trees. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that Donovan knew they were coming. It almost felt too easy, and Jake knew that meant something wasn't right. Bear, take the left side. Diesel, you're on the right. Vince, Shadow, and I will cover the front, Jake ordered, his voice calm but firm. The club moved into position, spreading out across the yard. Jake approached the front door slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his motorcycle club's emblem on his jacket. They had one chance to do this right. If Donovan was inside, they couldn't risk him getting away. He knocked. Hard. 3 quick raps on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, his fist pounding against the wood. Still nothing. Then he heard the sound of footsteps from inside. A shadow passed in front of the window. The door creaked open slowly, and Jake's eyes narrowed. Donovan stood there, dressed in casual clothes, his expression cold and guarded. What do you want? Donovan asked, his voice tight. I'm here for Maya and her mom, Jake said, his voice calm but laced with determination. You've done enough. This ends today. Donovan's eyes flickered, but he didn't move. You think you could just walk in here and tell me what to do? He sneered. I think you've been getting away with too much for too long, Jake replied. And it's over. Donovan's hand twitched at his side, and for a moment, Jake thought he might try something. But then, without warning, Donovan stepped back and slammed the door shut. We'll do this the hard way then, Jake muttered under his breath. He nodded to Diesel, who immediately moved to the side of the house, while the rest of the bikers spread out, surrounding the property. They couldn't let him run, and they couldn't let him hide behind his badge anymore. Donovan had made his choice. As Jake waited for the signal, his mind raced again. He thought of Maya, of the little girl who had run to them for help, and of the promise he had made to her father. He had no intention of breaking that promise now. Move in, Jake ordered. The bikers moved quickly, their steps heavy and purposeful. They didn't need to speak. They knew what needed to be done. The house would not be a safe place for Donovan anymore. They would find him, and they would make sure he couldn't hurt anyone again. The moment was tense, every second stretching out as they moved through the house. The front door was smashed open, the hinges screeching as it fell to the floor. Donovan was nowhere to be seen, but Jake wasn't fooled. He knew Donovan would be somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. Check every room, Jake called out. Don't leave anything to chance. As the bikers moved through the house, Jake's heart pounded in his chest. They were getting closer, and when they found Donovan, there would be no escape for him. He would face the consequences of his actions. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the weight of justice on his side. The sound of the door crashing to the ground echoed through the empty house. The moment of stillness that followed felt like an eternity. Jake Hawk Morrison's eyes scanned the interior of the home, his body poised for action. His team had already swept the living room, but Jake could feel something wasn't right. Donovan was close, but where? He didn't trust this. Donovan wouldn't go down without a fight, not a man like him. The tension was palpable as the bikers moved cautiously, their heavy boots thudding against the creaky floorboards. Diesel was at the back, making sure no one could sneak up on them, while Bear and Vince were methodically clearing rooms. Jake signaled to Shadow and Thorn to cover the upstairs, his mind never slowing down. The stakes were too high. He thought of Maya, the little girl who had led them here. Her innocent face still burned in his mind. She had witnessed the horrors of her own home, and now it was Jake's responsibility to make sure that no child would ever have to experience something like that again. The thought of her fear gave him the determination to push forward. They couldn't let Donovan get away. A sudden crash upstairs made Jake freeze. The others heard it too. It was unmistakable, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. Jake moved without thinking, charging up the stairs with quick, deliberate steps. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act. When he reached the top of the stairs, he found Donovan. He was standing in front of a door, his hand on the knob, his back to Jake. It was now or never. Donovan. Jake's voice was cold, firm. The man froze, his shoulders stiffening as he slowly turned around, a sneer on his face. You really think you can just come into my house and take me down? Donovan spat. Jake's eyes never left his hand instinctively gripping the handle of his leather jacket, ready for whatever was coming next. I'm not here to take you down, Donovan. I'm here to stop you. You're a coward, hiding behind a badge, hurting people who can't defend themselves. That ends now. Donovan's laugh echoed off the walls, hollow and desperate. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a group of criminals playing dress-up. Jake didn't flinch. We may be criminals, but at least we don't hide behind lies and power. At least we stand up for the innocent. Donovan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he might try to pull something, but instead, Donovan took a step back, his hand slowly moving to his waist. Jake tensed, ready for the worst. But instead of pulling a weapon, Donovan reached for the door behind him. I'm not afraid of you, Donovan growled, his fingers tightening on the door handle. You should be, Jake said, his voice low and steady. This is over. The door swung open, revealing a small, dark room. For a moment, Jake was confused. He thought Donovan might be trying to make a run for it, but the room was empty. No escape route, no secret passage. Jake's confusion didn't last long. He saw it, the small, dark shape on the floor in the corner of the room. A little girl curled, up in a ball, her face buried in her knees. Jake's heart dropped. It wasn't Maya, but it was another child, another victim. Jake rushed into the room, his instincts kicking in as he knelt beside the little girl. Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. The girl looked up, her wide eyes filled with fear. She couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. Her clothes were torn, and there was a dark bruise on her cheek. What's your name? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his anger was boiling. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. Ellie, she said. Ellie, where's your mom? Jake's heart sank as the girl shook her head, her lip quivering. She's gone. The room grew even quieter. Donovan had been hiding another child here, someone else he had hurt. This wasn't just about Maya's mother. It was about a pattern of abuse, one that had been going on for far too long. Jake stood up quickly, his rage building again. He looked at Donovan, who was standing in the doorway, his hands raised in surrender. You've done enough, Donovan. You're done. But Donovan's face twisted into something darker, his eyes narrowing in defiance. You think this ends here? You don't know who you're messing with. Jake's fists clenched. I know exactly who I'm messing with. You're nothing but a bully who uses his badge to control people. And you'll pay for what you've done. I'll make sure of that, Donovan sneered. Without another word, Jake moved swiftly, grabbing Donovan by the collar and pushing him against the wall, his face inches from Donovan's. Don't make me do this the hard way. Donovan sneered again, his confidence unwavering. You can't prove anything. You're just a bunch of bikers with no authority. Jake's voice dropped to a cold whisper. The only authority I need is protecting these kids. At that moment, the sound of sirens reached them. Police vehicles were closing in, but Jake didn't back down. He wasn't waiting for the law to sort this out. He was the law here, and Donovan was going to answer for everything he had done. The bikers were in place, ready for whatever came next. It was no longer just about protecting Maya's family. It was about standing up for all the children Donovan had hurt. Jake took a step back and nodded. To his crew, Let's end this, once and for all. The door slammed behind them as the bikers moved in to handle the situation. The fight for justice had only just begun, but Donovan was about to learn that the Iron Riders were more than ready to deliver it. The sound of the sirens grew louder, but it wasn't the law that Jake Hawk Morrison was waiting for. The Iron Riders had already made their move, and now it was time to confront the man who had been hiding behind a badge for far too long. Jake stood in the dim hallway, the weight of his leather jacket a constant reminder of the responsibility he had taken on. Donovan was still slumped against the wall, looking defeated but dangerous in his quiet rage. Jake stepped closer, his boots thudding against the floor, his focus never leaving Donovan. "You don't get to hide behind that badge anymore," Jake said, his voice low but filled with purpose. Donovan's eyes flickered with something dark, but he didn't speak. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the distant wail of approaching police vehicles. Jake took another step forward, his face inches from Donovan's. "This ends now," Jake repeated. Donovan's lips curled into a smirk. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Hawk. I'll make sure you pay for this." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, his anger rising. "You don't scare me, Donovan. You're nothing but a coward who hides behind his power and his badge. The only thing you're going to pay for is what you've done to these kids." Donovan's sneer faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you can just waltz in here and change things? The system's built for guys like me, Hawk. You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws." Jake shook his head, his eyes hard. "You've never understood what it means to protect people, have you? The law's not a shield for you to hide behind. It's supposed to be there to protect the innocent. Something you've forgotten." The words hit Donovan like a punch to the gut, and Jake could see his confidence waver for the first time. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone like Jake. But Jake wasn't done. "You've been hurting people for far too long, and I'm not going to stand by and let you do it anymore," Jake said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "This ends today, Donovan. You're going to pay for what you've done to Maya, to Ellie, and all the others you've hurt." At that moment, the door burst open, and the bikers flooded into the room, surrounding Donovan. They were all there, every member of the Iron Riders, standing united. Jake didn't need to say anything else. The message was clear. Donovan wasn't going anywhere until they had answers. "What do you want from me?" Donovan spat, his voice now laced with desperation. "You've got everything you need. You've got your revenge." Jake stepped back and gestured to the rest of the club. "We're not here for revenge. We're here for justice." Diesel, Bear, and the others moved in closer, their eyes fixed on Donovan, showing no fear. Jake took a deep breath, his mind focused on the task ahead. He wasn't about to let Donovan slip through their fingers, not after everything that had happened. "We'll do this the right way," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll make sure you face the consequences, and we'll make sure the truth comes out. No more hiding." The doorbell rang, a sharp, sudden sound that seemed to echo through the tense silence. It was the police finally arriving. But Jake wasn't worried. They had already taken control of the situation, and now it was just a matter of making sure everything was handled properly. The bikers stood firm as the police entered, their presence adding to the tension in the room. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't interfere. Jake turned to them. "Donovan's yours. He's the one you need to arrest." The lead officer, a tall man with a gruff demeanor, nodded. "We've got him." But Jake could tell there was more. There was a hesitation in the officer's eyes, a sense of uncertainty. He wasn't sure how much the Iron Riders had uncovered or how deep Donovan's ties went. "You're sure about this?" the officer asked, his voice cautious. "We're sure," Jake replied firmly. "And we'll be here to make sure the truth comes out." The officer hesitated for a moment longer, but then he nodded, signaling to his team to step forward and take Donovan into custody. As they cuffed him and let him out of the house, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The battle wasn't over yet, but they had taken the first step. Maya, Ellie, and all the other victims were one step closer to justice. The bikers stood in silence as Donovan was escorted away. Jake took one last look at the house, knowing that this was only the beginning. They had sent a message. No one was above the law, and the Iron Riders would fight for the innocent, no matter the cost. It's not over yet, Jake said to his crew, but this is the start of something bigger. We'll make sure no one else gets hurt. We're not backing down. Diesel grinned, cracking his knuckles. You know it, boss. And with that, they rode off into the night, their engines roaring as they left the past behind and headed toward a future where justice would always prevail. The sun was setting as Jake Hawk Morrison and the rest of the Iron Riders rolled out of Donovan's house. The job finally feeling like it was done, but deep down, Jake knew it wasn't over. The fight for justice had only just begun. As they made their way back to the clubhouse, the weight of the day settled on Jake's shoulders. The world around them had changed in those few hours, but the real challenge was still to come. The police had taken Donovan in, but the evidence was just the beginning. The truth about his actions, his connections, and the people who had helped him stay hidden, that was what they needed to uncover. The bikers rode in silence, the steady rumble of their engines cutting through the cool evening air. Diesel led the pack, followed by Bear, then Vince and the rest of the crew. Their minds were all on the same thing, but no one said a word. The streets seemed quieter than usual, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen. When they pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, Jake motioned for everyone to gather around. The door to the bar opened, and the heavy smell of stale beer and leather greeted them, but Jake didn't care. He was focused. "We've got work to do," he said, his voice low and firm. The bikers assembled around him, their faces filled with the same determination that had driven them this far. "We can't let Donovan go down like this. No, he's just one part of the problem. There's a bigger operation at play here, and we need to expose it. For Maya, for Ellie, for everyone he's hurt." Diesel grunted, his eyes narrowing. "What's the plan, boss?" Jake looked over his crew, his mind already working through the next steps. "We hit the streets. We find out who Donovan's connected to, and we start digging into his past. He's been getting away with too much for too long, and it's time we make him answer." Vince stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "We can't let him walk. Not after what he's done." "He won't," Jake replied. "But we need to be smart. We need to take him down the right way, or it'll all fall apart. We do this by the book, but we make sure we get to the truth. We got the law on our side now, but we need to make sure everyone knows exactly who Donovan is and what he's been doing." Bear nodded. "We've got this. We're not leaving any stone unturned." "Right," Jake said. "Let's get to work. We need to gather everything we can on Donovan's associates, his history, everything. And we need to do it fast. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to stop him." The bikers dispersed, each one heading off to do their part. Some hit the streets, talking to their contacts, getting the word out. Others dug into Donovan's background, searching through public records, talking to old acquaintances, and digging for anything that might connect him to the larger network of corruption. Jake spent the night in his office, staring at the files in front of him. His mind kept going back to Maya and Ellie, to the little girl who had trusted them to keep her safe. He couldn't let them down. Not now. Not when they were this close. The next few hours felt like an eternity as Jake worked with his crew to piece together the puzzle. Every connection they found, every lead they followed, seemed to point to a much larger web of corruption than they had ever imagined. But there were still missing pieces, and they couldn't let up. By dawn, they had a clearer picture. Donovan had been using his position as a cop to protect a network of criminals, people who were involved in everything from human trafficking to drug running. The more they uncovered, the angrier Jake became. He had known Donovan was dangerous, but this was worse than he had thought. The realization hit him hard. They weren't just fighting to protect Maya and Ellie anymore. They were fighting to bring down an entire criminal operation, one that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Jake knew the next steps would be even harder. They had to act quickly, but they had to be careful. Donovan's connections were deep, and if they made one wrong move, it could all come crashing down. But Jake wasn't going to let that stop him. "We're going after them," he said to his crew as they gathered back at the clubhouse. "We've got enough to go after Donovan's associates. This ends now. We make sure no one else gets hurt. We make sure that the truth comes out, no matter what." The bikers stood tall, their resolve unshakable. They had already come this far, and they weren't about to stop now. "Let's do this," Diesel said, his voice filled with determination. Jake gave a nod. "We've got a job to finish." As the bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, Jake knew that this would be the hardest fight they had ever faced. But they were ready. They had a cause, and they would see it through, no matter what it took. The day had broken clear and bright, but Jake Hawk Morrison felt no relief. His mind was still churning over everything they had uncovered, and the gravity of their mission weighed heavily on his shoulders. The bikers were gearing up for the next stage of their plan, but Jake knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Donovan might have been the face of their problems, but the truth they were digging into went much deeper. It wasn't just Donovan. It was the network of corruption, the people behind him who had been pulling strings and using power for far too long. And the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the battle wasn't just about protecting a family anymore. It was about taking down an entire system that had been hiding in the shadows. The sun had barely risen when the Iron Riders gathered back at their clubhouse. There was an unspoken tension between them, a shared understanding that what they were doing wasn't just a favor or a quick fix. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for people who couldn't fight back, for victims who had been silenced for far too long. Diesel was the first to speak as he walked into the room. "We got the info," he said, tossing a stack of papers onto the table in front of Jake. "Donovan's been keeping a list of his associates. The bigger players are still in the shadows, but we've got names. We've got leads." Jake nodded, scanning the papers quickly, his mind processing the information. This was the breakthrough they needed. "All right, everyone knows their role. We're not just going after Donovan anymore. We're going after the entire network." "What's the plan?" Bear asked, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. Jake stood up, his posture strong. "We take down the entire operation, starting with his connections. We make sure the law gets everything they need to put these guys away for good. We can't let up, not now." He looked around at the bikers, meeting each of their eyes. "This is it. We're making sure no one else gets hurt." The crew nodded, their faces hard with resolve. The bikers had never backed down from a fight, but this wasn't just about muscle. It was about strategy. Jake had already contacted a few trusted allies in law enforcement. They had the information, but the final push had to come from them. With the network in place, Jake and his crew split into smaller teams, each tasked with gathering intel, reaching out to informants, and getting the necessary proof that would finally bring the corruption to light. As the bikers rode out, the adrenaline was palpable, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were making progress, but Donovan's network was more dangerous than they realized. The city was about to find out just how deep the corruption went, and Jake wasn't sure who was going to come out on top. By midday, they had met up at a local diner, the old kind with chrome accents and checkered floors. Jake's team was already gathered, waiting for the updates. The mood was serious, everyone working fast to get the final pieces of the puzzle. "We've got confirmation," Vince said, flipping open his phone to show the rest of the crew. "Donovan's associates are planning a big deal tonight. They're moving something big. We need to intercept it." "Where are they moving?" Diesel asked, leaning forward. Vince hesitated for a moment before replying, "Drugs. But not just any drugs. They've been moving weapons too. This is bigger than we thought." Jake felt his blood run cold. This was it. This wasn't just about busting up a small-time operation. This was organized crime on a much larger scale, and they were going to stop it. Jake stood up, his eyes scanning the room, making sure the bikers were all on the same page. "We hit them tonight. This operation ends now." The bikers didn't hesitate. They were ready. As the afternoon slipped away and night began to fall, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Jake and his crew rode out under the cover of darkness, the engines of their bikes roaring to life as they made their way toward the location where Donovan's associates were meeting. The city was quiet, eerily so, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. They arrived at a warehouse near the outskirts of town, the lights dim and the area deserted. The plan was set. They would move in fast, intercept the deal, and make sure the law had everything they needed to bring the operation down for good. The bikers spread out, taking their positions around the warehouse. Jake took a deep breath, his hands steady on the handlebars of his bike. This was the moment they had been preparing for. the moment when they would finally take control of the situation. As they moved into position, Jake felt a surge of determination. No more games. No more waiting. They were going to bring the truth to light, and they weren't going to stop until every single person involved in this corruption was brought to justice. The plan was set, and tonight, the Iron Riders would ride into history. The night was alive with anticipation as the Iron Riders gathered outside the warehouse, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like the cool evening air. The lights were dim, and the sounds of the city were distant, muffled by the thick walls of the industrial complex. Jake Hawk Morrison surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning the shadows, every detail sharp in his mind. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the final confrontation with Donovan's associates. It was time to bring the operation down. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would storm the warehouse, stop the deal before it could go through, and make sure the police were there to make arrests. The bikers had been in position for over an hour, their bikes parked out of sight, engines silent. Jake, Diesel, and Bear were at the front, ready to breach the entrance. Vince, Shadow, and the others were covering the perimeter, making sure no one could escape. The deal was supposed to happen soon. Jake checked his watch. They had no more time to waste. "This is it," Jake whispered to Diesel, his voice calm but filled with resolve. Diesel gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Let's do this," he said quietly. The three of them moved into position, their boots soft on the gravel as they approached the warehouse door. The plan was to hit fast, no hesitation. They couldn't afford to give anyone a chance to react. With one swift motion, Jake kicked the door open, the sound of it crashing against the wall filling the night air. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. A group of men, all wearing dark clothing, stood in the center of the room, a table laid out with packages and large crates. Weapons, drugs, money, it was all here. But the bikers didn't flinch. They had seen it all before. The real enemy was not the merchandise. It was the people who had been hiding in the shadows, controlling everything. "Get on the ground," Jake yelled, his voice cutting through the silence. The men froze, surprised but not immediately panicked. Jake's eyes locked on the leader, a tall man with a scar running across his face, his hand already hovering near a gun at his waist. Jake's hand tightened on the grip of his own weapon, but he didn't pull it out yet. "We're not here for your merchandise," Jake said, his voice steady. "We're here for you." The leader sneered, but his hand didn't move from his waist. "You think you could just come in here and take us down?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws." Jake stood firm, his eyes never leaving the man. "You're the one who's out of control," he said. "You've been using people, hiding behind power, and now it's over. You're going to answer for what you've done." The men around the table began to move, some reaching for weapons, others standing frozen in place. But Jake didn't wait for them to act. "Now," he shouted. The Iron Riders surged into the room, a wall of leather and steel. There was no hesitation as the bikers moved in, disarming the men one by one. The leader's hand finally reached for his gun, but Diesel was faster. In one fluid motion, Diesel grabbed his wrist and twisted, knocking the weapon to the ground. "Not today," Diesel growled, pinning the man to the floor. Jake moved quickly, making sure the rest of the room was secure. The bikers had the situation under control, but there was still more to do. He looked over at Vince, who was on the phone with the police, making sure they knew exactly what was happening. The sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer by the second. The deal had been stopped, but the real work was just beginning. The bikers made sure to gather everything they could, the evidence, the documents, and the connections that would expose the entire operation. As the police arrived, Jake stepped back, watching them swarm into the warehouse. He knew they had done the right thing, but there was still a part of him that wasn't satisfied. This wasn't just about stopping one deal. It was about bringing down the entire network. The police began to take the criminals into custody, but Jake's thoughts were already on the next steps. The battle wasn't over. Donovan's associates were just the tip of the iceberg. They had uncovered a small piece of the puzzle, but the real challenge lay in taking down the larger network, the people who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The Iron Riders had made a difference, but the fight for justice was far from over. As the police began to clean up, Jake stood outside the warehouse, his eyes scanning the horizon. The city was quiet again, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The Iron Riders had set something in motion, and now there was no turning back. They were in this together, and they would see it through. No one will be left behind. And for Maya, for Ellie, and for every other victim who had been silenced, they would make sure that justice prevailed. As the days passed, Jake Hawk Morrison stood on the edge of the parking lot outside the Iron Riders clubhouse, watching the sun sink lower into the horizon. The fight against Donovan and his associates was far from over, but the bikers had done what they set out to do. They had stopped the deal, taken down the criminals, and handed them over to the law. But something gnawed at Jake. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that Donovan was only a small piece in a much larger puzzle. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. The network they had uncovered in that warehouse was just the beginning. Who else was involved? Who were the people pulling the strings behind the scenes? He knew they had to keep pushing, keep digging, but this time they needed more than just muscle. They needed information, hard evidence that would bring down the entire operation. Jake turned to Diesel, who had been silent, staring into the distance, lost in thought. Diesel was the quiet one, but when he spoke, it carried weight. "You think we're done?" Diesel asked, his voice rough, his gaze intense. Jake shook his head. "No, this is just the beginning." The sound of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, and the rest of the bikers began to arrive at the clubhouse. The tension in the air was thick, but there was also a sense of victory. They had made a difference, but the fight was far from over. As the crew gathered around, Jake addressed them, his voice steady, but his eyes burning with determination. "We've hit them hard, but there's more. Donovan was just a pawn in a much bigger game, and we're going to take down the whole operation. But we can't do it alone. We need to start making some serious moves. We need to gather more intel, dig deeper into these guys' connections, and get everything we can on the people behind Donovan." Bear stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the others. "What do we do next, boss?" Jake looked at each member of his crew, his mind working through the next steps. "We split up. Some of us will stay in the city, get eyes on the people connected to Donovan. Others will reach out to our contacts, anyone we trust, to see what else we can dig up. And we need to keep Maya and her mom safe. We can't afford any more surprises." "You got it, Jake," Diesel said, his voice low. "We'll handle it." The bikers didn't hesitate. They knew what needed to be done. They had fought for justice before, but this time, it was bigger. They were not just going after one man. They were going after an entire system. As they set their plans into motion, Jake found himself once again reflecting on the promises he had made, to Maya's father, to the people they had saved, and to himself. The weight of those promises was heavier than any battle they had fought before. The next day was a blur of activity. The bikers spread out across the city, making connections, digging into records, talking to informants. They were closing in on the remaining members of the operation, but it wasn't easy. The deeper they went, the more they realized just how far this network reached. They uncovered ties to powerful people in local government, shady business owners, and criminal organizations that operated in the shadows. Each lead took them further into a world of corruption and betrayal, a world that Jake had never imagined. It wasn't just drugs and weapons that these people were trafficking. They were controlling lives, manipulating the system, and hiding behind the law. And the more Jake learned, the angrier he became. But even with all the pieces falling into place, they still didn't have enough. They needed more concrete evidence, more intel that could finally bring down the people pulling the strings. That's when one of Jake's contacts, a former officer who owed him a favor, came through with the breakthrough they needed. The officer had managed to dig up a confidential list of names of the people involved in the operation, people who had been working with Donovan to keep the system under control. "This is it," Jake muttered, holding the list in his hands. "This is everything we need." The names on the list were like a roadmap, leading straight to the heart of the operation. Jake's mind raced as he began to strategize their next move. They would hit hard, but they needed to act quickly. The longer they waited, the more time the criminals had to cover their tracks. It was time to go on the offensive. Jake gathered the crew once again, his voice resolute. This is it, everyone. We got the names. We got the connections. Now we finish this. The bikers nodded in agreement. They had been through hell and back, but now they were closer than ever to bringing down the entire operation. It was time to end this, to make sure the people who had been hiding in the shadows finally faced justice. With the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Jake felt a sense of finality begin to settle in. They were about to take the fight to the people who had been operating with impunity for too long. The mission was clear, and there was no turning back now. Let's do this, Jake said, and the Iron Riders roared to life, ready to finish what they had started. The night was thick with tension as Jake Hawk Morrison and the Iron Riders made their way to the location. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and Jake could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This was the moment they had been working toward, the final strike that would bring down the network once and for all. The streets were quiet as they approached, their motorcycles cutting through the cool air like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Diesel led the charge with Bear, Vince, and the others close behind. Jake's mind raced, thinking of everything they had uncovered. The network they were targeting wasn't just about drugs and weapons anymore. It was about power, control, and corruption at the highest levels. Donovan was just one small piece in this larger operation, but taking him down was the key to exposing everything. The club had gathered enough evidence, and now they were ready to make their move. The plan was simple: hit fast, take control, and make sure the police had everything they needed to put the criminals away for good. As they neared the location, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They had been careful, methodical, but in the back of his mind, a nagging sense of uncertainty lingered. Something told him they weren't the only ones watching. "We're here," Diesel said, braking. Jake's thoughts. The warehouse loomed in front of them, dark and ominous. The Iron Riders slowed their bikes and circled around, taking positions. It was time. "Stay sharp," Jake muttered, his voice low. "We move quick and silent. No mistakes." The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces hard with determination. This wasn't just another job. This was personal. They had all seen the damage Donovan and his network had caused, and they weren't going to let it slide. Jake's heart pounded as they approached the entrance. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. They were close, closer than ever before to bringing everything into the light. As they reached the warehouse, Jake motioned for Bear and Diesel to take the left side, while Vince and Shadow covered the right. They moved quickly, staying low, their boots silent on the concrete floor. Jake and the rest of the crew made their way to the front, weapons at the ready. They had to make sure no one escaped, no one got away. They couldn't afford any slip-ups. The warehouse was quiet. Too quiet. Jake's instincts were on high alert, and he knew something was wrong. The door creaked open, and the Iron Riders slipped inside. The place was eerily still, the air heavy with the smell of dust and old machinery. But Jake could hear something faint in the distance. Voices. Low, hushed murmurs. He signaled for the bikers to move forward, the group inching closer to the source of the sound. They crept down a long corridor, the noise growing louder with every step. And then they saw it. A group of men standing around a table, their backs turned. It was the same men from the warehouse where they had intercepted the deal. Donovan's associates. They were making plans, talking about shipments, about moving their merchandise. Jake's jaw clenched. They were talking about the very thing he had sworn to stop. The exploitation, the trafficking, the destruction. This wasn't just about taking down Donovan. This was about ending everything he represented. Jake motioned to the bikers, signaling them to get into position. They couldn't wait any longer. This had to be done now. As they moved in, the men at the table turned in surprise. "What the hell?" one of them yelled. Jake stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "You're done. The game's over." The men froze, realizing too late that they were surrounded. Jake's eyes locked on the man in charge, a tall, burly figure who stepped forward with a sneer. "You think you could stop us? You're nothing but a bunch of thugs." Jake didn't flinch. We're more than that. We're the ones who are going to end this. The man reached for a weapon, but before he could pull it out, Diesel was on him. With a swift move, Diesel disarmed him and slammed him against the wall. "You're not going anywhere," Diesel growled. The other bikers quickly moved to secure the rest of the men, their actions precise and calculated. They had done this before, but the stakes had never been this high. Jake turned to the rest of the group. "Get them on the ground now." As they restrained the men, Jake's mind raced. This was it, the final push. He was close, so close to taking down everything these men had built. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to deal with the higher-ups, the people who had been behind everything. Jake couldn't let them slip away. As the bikers worked quickly to tie the men up, Jake pulled out his phone and called his contact in law enforcement. "It's done," he said. "We need backup. Get the police in here now." The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, but Jake knew they didn't have much time. They had to move fast before the people at the top had a chance to cover their tracks. The bikers secured the area, and as the first officers arrived, Jake's heart slowed just a fraction. They had done it. They had stopped the operation. And now, with the law on their side, the rest would be handled. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. There were more people to bring to justice, more criminals hiding in the shadows. But tonight, the Iron Riders had made a stand, and they weren't backing down. The aftermath of the raid was almost surreal. Jake Hawk Morrison stood at the entrance of the warehouse, watching as the police swept through the building, gathering evidence, and taking down the remaining criminals. The bikers had done their part, and now it was in the hand of the law. For a moment, everything seemed still. The weight of the night's actions began to settle in. Donovan's associates were in custody, the network was being dismantled, and the Iron Riders had achieved something they hadn't done in years. They had made a difference, and they were on the right side of the law. Jake turned to Diesel, who was standing beside him, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the waning light. Diesel's face was hard, unreadable as always, but Jake knew what was going through his mind. They had come a long way since their days in the streets, and tonight, they had taken down an operation that had hurt so many people. "It's done," Diesel said quietly, his voice steady, but there was something in his tone that suggested a sense of finality, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Jake nodded, but his thoughts were still clouded. There was so much more to do. "We've hit them hard, but this won't be the last time," Jake said. "The law will handle the rest, but we still have to make sure they don't slip through the cracks. We have to make sure that what we've started today isn't forgotten." Diesel looked out across the parking lot, his gaze distant. "It's not about the law, Jake," he said slowly. "It's about making sure those people don't hurt anyone else. We've been fighting this fight for a long time. It's not over until it's really over." Jake exhaled, his breath heavy. Diesel was right. The battle was never truly over. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight. But tonight, they had made a stand, and it was a stand that couldn't be ignored. The rest of the bikers gathered around, their faces filled with quiet satisfaction. Maya and her mother, who had been safe for the night, were now in protective custody, away from the danger they had faced for so long. The truth had come out, and the wheels of justice were turning. But Jake couldn't help but feel that this was only a small part of the larger picture. They had won this fight, but what about the others? What about the people they had left behind, the ones still trapped in the shadows? There was still much work to be done. "We're not stopping," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying over the group. "We'll keep an eye on things. We'll make sure that what we've started doesn't die here. This isn't just about stopping one criminal operation. It's about making sure the system changes. Making sure people like Donovan never have the power to hurt anyone again." The bikers nodded in agreement. They understood what Jake was saying. They had been a part of this community for years, fighting their own battles, sometimes on the wrong side of the law, but always with the goal of protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. Now, they had the chance to make that change, to be the force for good that they had always wanted to be. "We're going to make sure no one gets left behind," Jake continued, his eyes sweeping over the crew. "We're going to keep fighting for the people who need it most." The bikers shared a silent moment of understanding. They had always been the outsiders, the ones who lived on the edge of society. But tonight they had crossed that line. They had made a difference. And for the first time, it felt like they were on the right side of history. "Let's get back to the clubhouse," Jake said, his tone resolute. "We've done good tonight, but tomorrow we start again." The engines roared to life as the bikers mounted their motorcycles. The air hummed with the sound of their collective power as they revved their bikes and made their way back through the streets. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. As the night stretched on, Jake knew they would continue to fight. There was always more to be done, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were winning. The world had been changed, if only a little. And Jake Hawk Morrison was ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, the quiet of the city began to feel like a distant memory. The Iron Riders had done their part. They had exposed the network, brought down the criminals, and ensured that Donovan's reign of terror was over. But for Jake Hawk Morrison, it was never just about winning a single battle. It was about ensuring that the fight for justice never ended. The bikers had returned to the clubhouse after the operation was over. The air was thick with the scent of gas and leather, but something else lingered in the air now. It was a sense of accomplishment, but also a quiet resolve. The world was different now, and the riders knew that they had played a role in changing it. Jake leaned back against his bike, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The calm that had settled on the city after the storm felt almost too still. Jake knew that even though the immediate threat had been stopped, the work wasn't finished. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was always more to do. "We did good, Jake," Diesel said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. Jake looked over at him and nodded. "We did, but it's not over." Diesel didn't argue. He didn't need to. The truth was, they had made a difference, but the fight wasn't won in a single night. The fight for justice was something that had no end, no finish line. The Iron Riders were used to living on the edge, but now they've found a new purpose. They weren't just outlaws anymore. They were protectors, standing between the innocent and the people who sought to exploit them. That responsibility was a heavy one, but it was a responsibility they were willing to carry. As the bikers gathered around, Jake knew they were ready for whatever came next. Maya and her mother were safe now, living in a new city away from the danger that had followed them for so long. They were just one story in a much larger fight, but to Jake, they were a reminder of why they did what they did. He thought of the other victims, the ones whose stories had been silenced, the ones still trapped in systems of abuse and exploitation. There were still people out there who needed help, and the Iron Riders would be there for them, just as they had been there for Maya and her mother. "We don't stop," Jake said, his voice firm and resolute. "We keep fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves. We keep going no matter what." The bikers nodded, their expressions serious. They understood what Jake meant. They had all seen the consequences of what happened when people like Donovan were allowed to operate unchecked. They had seen how it hurt families, destroyed lives. And they weren't going to let that happen again. "We'll keep fighting, Jake," Diesel said, his voice steady. "We won't back down." Jake's heart swelled with pride. These men and women had come together, not just to right a wrong, but to create something bigger. They had changed their world, and they would continue to do so. "Good," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "This is our fight, and we're not backing down." The sound of engines revving filled the air as the Iron Riders mounted their bikes, ready to take on whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. They were ready. They were a family now, bound together by their purpose. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Iron Riders rode out into the night, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. They had fought for justice, and they would continue to do so, no matter where the road took them. Because the fight for justice was never over. It was a fight they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.